My name is Lauren Medoff, and I'm Senior Counsel at 7-Eleven. I am happy to welcome you all here today for the 10th Annual ACC Symposium. And we are so excited that we had the opportunity to do this event as a hybrid event, and we will have many more of those throughout the rest of the year. Thanks again, V&E, and let's start the show.
So you're in your boardroom and a client or prospective client comes in and says, I've got this great infrastructure project investment and I'd like you to hear me out. He puts up in his confidential info memorandum slide deck this fancy routing image that shows, for our discussion purposes, an above ground pipeline. But you can imagine that it might be a transmission line or a below ground pipeline or some other linear project. It could also be a storage yard or a marine terminal, some infrastructure project. But for our discussion, we're going to look at this above ground pipeline. And he says, so we're going to bring liquids, oil, from upstate down to a refinery at the coast. Upstate is up on the horizon, and he says, you know, up there, we're passing through a national forest. It's only about 10 miles. We could route around the national forest. That might add 80 miles to our route. We cross another 100, 200 landowners. So we think the best route is we're just going to cross the national forest right there. He notes that we're going to cross a couple of large water bodies. A direct route might cross right through a very popular recreational lake, but they rerouted it to go just below the lake, right below a federal dam, where just below that dam, there's nothing but some old levees and maybe some inundated bottomlands. Also notes that there's another crossing of a wild and scenic river, and that the United States seems to own lands at both of the dam crossing and the wild and scenic river crossing. Your prospective client says, there's some interesting wildlife that we've learned about as we've routed this pipeline. We know that there's some designated critical habitat for this endangered bird, but not to worry, it's only there for a couple of months out of the year. There's also some springs that we'll cross that have these endangered snails and mollusks that don't exist anywhere else in the world. And there's some threatened lizard in the desert, but no worries, we'll think we'll be able to minimize those risks. And as an afterthought, he looks back at the national forest and says, oh, and there might be a rare bat that lives in some of those trees. As you look closely at this map, you see that it crosses very near some tribal reservation lands and a historic district. And he goes, yes, we saw those, we realized they were there, but we just barely narrowly avoided crossing those boundaries. And so we've avoided any impacts there. I think we're good. And last, as the pipeline approaches the refinery, it crosses some large grasslands. And he says, hey, don't worry about it. There's no federal or state lands there. In fact, most of them are owned by this very wealthy landowner who has this very, very large ranch. He hates our project, but that's okay. Once we get it approved, we'll be able to go get eminent domain and we'll just plow right through his land. So what do you think? You kick back and consider for a moment and realize that this is a law school, environmental law, issue spotting bonanza. So we've given you a lot of issues here that perhaps no one project would trigger all of these environmental considerations. In fact, we've heavily weighted these issues to be issues that you might encounter in project development. And I understand that investment opportunities don't always come with just a sketch drawing of what they want to do. Your investment opportunity might actually be an operating asset or commodity positioning or something that's more built and already having an operating revenue. But as we talk through some of the issues, we're going to focus on the project development phase, but several of the issues would equally apply to assets that are operating, that are generating revenues. So with that, let's first talk about where in the development project, development process, a project may be when you are presented with an investment opportunity. First question, is it built? Is it operating? If it's not built yet, or if it's under construction, do you have all of the authorizations you need to build and operate? Now, a preliminary question when talking about authorizations is, who do you need authorizations from? And one of our early tasks in each investment review and project development program is to figure out what are all the state agencies, what are all the federal agencies, what are all the government approvals and authorizations and consultations we need to go through. Primary among those is the question of, do you have a federal nexus? That's an important consideration, because if there is a federal authorization you need, it might be categorized as what is called a major federal action under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. If you have a major federal action under NEPA, then the federal agency cannot grant its approval or take its action until it goes through a public involvement and agency-informed decision-making process that is procedural only, but as we'll discuss later, procedure has power, and it can risk delays, project revisions, and risk your bottom line. Now, as we look at other possible pressure points in project development, another one is, do you cross federal lands? Do you need a right-of-way from the Bureau of Land Management? Do you cross any special management areas, a fish and wildlife refuge or a national park or a land set aside for conservation? Do you cross civil works, which might not actually even be owned by the federal government? It might be levees that the federal government helped build in the 50s or 60s that are now operated by local levee districts, but that qualify as civil works that require the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to review your project before you can cross them. When you look at routing projects or projects that need some real estate authorization, you can quickly see how a state or federal agency could exercise veto power over your investment project. You can look in the headlines and see that the current furor over the Dakota Access Pipeline that carries crude from the Bakken field in North Dakota into the Midwest for some Midwest refining. The current legal wrangling over that is for this massive hundreds and hundreds of mile long pipeline. It's over the crossing of, I believe it's 0.2 mile of federal lands at Lake Oahe, where some tribal interests are challenging that the government didn't study the impacts of oil spill risk on the water supplies there, for over 0.2 mile of an easement. There, a federal district judge ordered the pipeline, an operating asset, ordered the pipeline to be emptied and shut down during the pendency of the government's review. That shutdown order was stayed by the DC Circuit, but it is right now back before the court, considering the possibility of entering an injunction to stop an operating asset. And at the same time, the Biden administration's Corps of Engineers is assessing its ability to step in for a pipeline that crosses a federal easement that has been vacated and has the ability to order a shutdown itself. And so even if you're an operating asset, there may still be this veto aspect of your operations. And it's not only on the federal front. Just yesterday, there was there were oral arguments at the Supreme Court dealing with a interstate natural gas pipeline that's trying to build into New Jersey, where the state of New Jersey has claimed sovereign immunity from eminent domain actions, where the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, has cited the pipeline. And so federal lands, state lands, those considerations are important as you think about your ability to get a project off of the design phase and into the operating phase. We also think about water crossings. Aquatic features is an area where, even if it's private land, the federal government has the ability to step in and exercise some jurisdiction over aquatic features that are on your property, streams, wetlands, springs, things of that nature. And it's very difficult to route large projects entirely around those kinds of water resources. There's also tribal and cultural issues. When you have tribal potential effects on tribal resources, you may have trust obligations. The government may have government-to-government consultation obligations, sovereign to sovereign. And as we look at endangered species, there's a perception that the Trump administration weakened protection for endangered fish and wildlife, and the likelihood that there will be a pendulum swing the other way. The last note I have on the slide here is a critical look at avoiding all federal triggers. Sometimes aspersion is cast at projects that can be built without needing any federal review. That can sometimes be applauded, because if you avoid all of the impacts to these resources, perhaps you're avoiding all of those significant impacts, and that's a good thing. The downside is that it may incite some litigation and injunction risk as opponents seek to stop your project, alleging that you have skirted necessary environmental reviews that would have minimized impacts. So that's a look at the process. Now let's turn to a different question. Who are the decision makers? And how might that value your infrastructure investment? As administrations change, there's always some sort of pendulum swing. And here I've decided to illustrate this pendulum swing by looking at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, which has jurisdiction over natural gas infrastructure, interstate natural gas infrastructure. FERC commissioners are appointed by the president. They act as an independent agency, and you can look at the decision-making of those FERC commissioners and get an idea of just how the administration pendulum swing occurs. Here on the screen, we have Commissioner, now Chairman Glick, Democratic appointee, and next to him, his predecessor, Republican appointee, Commissioner Danley. Commissioner Glick has long opposed what is perceived as the rubber stamping of natural gas infrastructure projects, where he believes that not enough consideration is given to greenhouse gas emissions, climate change effects, impacts on landowners, eminent domain concerns, environmental justice concerns. And so with that, he has arrived, taken chairmanship of the commission, and is, number one, holding back most actions. There have been very, very few project approvals since he became commissioner since he became chairman in January. And he has reopened the review of policy statement that would govern the commission's action. And so infrastructure projects that are in development that might need to go through FERC now must consider whether they will be called to analyze and then perhaps mitigate on carbon impacts. If you have a midstream pipeline, Commissioner Glick would have the NEPA analysis of that midstream asset, look at all of the impacts upstream on well development, natural gas extraction, hydraulic fracturing, water use, greenhouse gas emissions, and all of the downstream impacts. Where is this gas combusted, and what impact does that have on global climate change and climate resiliency? Commissioner Glick is also championing expansion into environmental justice, where the commission will look more closely at whether there is a disproportionate impact of natural gas infrastructure on minority communities or low-income communities. So these are areas where a project that looks good on paper might be more difficult to get permitted and built. And it's not only for the building of projects. If you have an operating asset and a years old certificate from the commission, it might be at risk. The commission just 2 months ago issued a briefing order to review operating emissions for an existing facility, existing certificate, to decide whether it believes it has the authority, or if it has the authority to actually make changes to that previous order, even though that order is final and unappealable. So even if you have an operating asset, these environmental justice or emission or landowner issues can still threaten the value of that infrastructure. I'd also note that this isn't limited to federal action. Just yesterday, the California AG's office announced that they are expanding to 11 attorneys, the number of personnel that focus on taking environmental justice actions to enforce development in California in support of environmental justice initiatives. So that's, I also put on the screen a couple of the other key players. New CEQ chair, Brenda Mallory, Deb Helland at the Department of the Interior, Michael Regan at EPA, who similarly are making pushes to expand the NEPA reviews and support the other pendulum swings on environmental justice and climate action. So now just for a moment, let's look a little bit more at that process, the NEPA process that we've talked about, and how that might impact your infrastructure investment. NEPA's twin goals are to make sure that the government agency is well informed about its decision-making and to involve the public. There's some competing perspectives about NEPA. Is it just paperwork, check the box, or is procedure power? The NEPA process often results in opponents getting a bullhorn where they can loudly proclaim their opposition and the reasons for the opposition to a project. But at the same time, that might allow the developers to suss out what the actual areas of friction are and then engage to see if they can resolve those. The NEPA process lays out a number of mandatory steps. Some of the opportunities you have would be full engagement with the communities at issue and full engagement with the agencies at issue, so that you can avoid the risk of delay. Those are just vanilla NEPA issues. Let's talk about the pendulum swing in the Biden administration. The current, or for 40 years, NEPA regs promulgated in 1978 governed NEPA review at the federal level. The Trump administration revised those in 2020, got them in under the wire before the administration change, streamlining what the NEPA process was in a way that would allow infrastructure projects to get permitted and built faster. The Biden administration is likely to reverse course on this. And so currently permitted projects that are being constructed or that are constructed would face an easier route than what might come under these Biden administration revisions. We don't know exactly what they will be, but they will likely reverse course to the pre-Trump administration review. And we do know that the Biden administration has asked, in litigation over the Trump NEPA rules, has asked that they be remanded to the agency so they can spend a couple of years figuring out the right approach to take. Primarily so that they can ensure that climate change, greenhouse gas emission issues, and environmental justice issues, two topics that I continue to speak about over and over, primarily to address those issues in project development. So when we look at NEPA risks, the risk is more time, more analysis, as climate change, cumulative impacts, environmental justice issues are considered. Greater outreach, greater attention to your project can lead to greater delays. Greater delays leads to greater opportunity for investors to bail, for the project to be derailed. And all of that leads to increased cost of project investment. The opportunities, as I mentioned, are public engagement and coalition building to see how you can navigate those federal review processes. Now, the last segment that I'd like to touch on is just a little foray into a couple of the substantive environmental factors that might touch on investment risk. I chose two examples. The first one is waters. The second one is species. In the waters example, we talked about how the federal government has the ability to exercise jurisdiction over private property when it is a water of the United States. Now, just what is water of the United States? That's been fiercely litigated over the last 2 decades. The Supreme Court has not clarified the matter and in fact has muddied the waters a bit. A little bit of that history is that, a little bit of the recent history is that the Obama administration revised the definition of waters of the United States in what it called the Clean Water Rule that took a more expansive view of what waters were subject to federal jurisdiction. The Trump administration came with the Navigable Waters Protection Rule that took a much narrower approach to federal jurisdiction. The Clean Water Rule took one prevailing sentiment at the Supreme Court and made a rule out of that. The Trump administration took another prevailing sentiment at the Supreme Court, and those are competing views of the extent of federal jurisdiction. Very time-intensive litigation that at any point never actually ends, because before it ends, the administration changes and a new rulemaking comes into force. Right now, the Trump administration's Navigable Waters Protection Rule, or a narrow approach to jurisdiction over waters, is in force all across the country in every state. In litigation against that rule, the Biden administration would like that to be remanded so that it can take its time to develop a new rule that takes a more expansive view of waters. The Biden administration is likely taking a long game, knowing that it needs to create the right record to create a rule that will survive. The Supreme Court would love Congress to step in and actually clarify this. That's not happened in decades. It's not likely to happen. The implications for this are projects, infrastructure projects, development projects that touch on waters. It's difficult to know exactly what the extent of that jurisdiction will be. There's one project I'm aware of in Arizona that a large mining project that under the old rule had many dozens of acres and a very difficult permitting pathway with the Corps of Engineers for a project. But under the Trump administration rule, all of those waters are determined to be state waters only, not federal waters, and it no longer needs that Corps of Engineers permit. And so it turned out to be a very consequential shift depending on which rule you're applying. The last example I have on the screen is about species. Here I selected the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is a century-old statute to basically control the harms of overhunting of migratory birds. And it criminalizes the take, or the intentional killing or harming of a migratory bird. But is it always intentional? It criminalizes the take of it. Whether it is intentional or not is up, or I'm sorry, whether it's criminal to do it unintentionally is what has been swinging back and forth. Under the Obama administration, it was criminal for a migratory bird to be taken even if you didn't intend it. And so if you had an operating windmill asset, or if you had an upstream oil asset that had pits that birds might become entrained in, those killings would be criminally prohibited under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So there are several circuit courts that disagree with that criminal penalties can be applied with that kind of strict liability. And they have interpreted the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to only apply to intentional take. The Biden administration arrived and is swinging the pendulum right back the other way, so that migratory bird take is only prohibited criminally if it's intentional. This is important as you think about operating assets, not just construction, because those operations that might result in take of migratory birds, your risk of criminal enforcement is likely to depend primarily on, are those assets operating where the circuit courts have taken a more lenient view, or is it operating where the circuit courts have taken a more stringent view of the extent of criminal liability under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act? So we've given you a high-level overview of just some of these environmental risks that can affect your investment and how the pendulum swing of administration change can affect the value of those investments and the opportunity you have to move plans into operating and money-making assets. We've talked about agencies, we've talked about processes, we've talked about a couple of different natural resources. With that, I'd like to turn time over to my colleague, Corinne Snow, who will talk more about investments and other considerations on infrastructure development.
Thanks, Brandon. And while we're swapping over, just wanted to remind everyone that we're going to try and have time for Q&A at the end. If you are listening remotely, you can put those into the Q&A box. If you're there in person, then I think there's going to be an opportunity to ask with a microphone there. And I'll try and throw our contact information up again at the end, just in case there isn't time to get to your question. So you can email me or Brandon directly, and we will then try and answer your questions. So Brandon talked about a bunch of the different environmental hurdles that you might have to jump over in order to get your infrastructure project up and running. I'm going to talk about some opportunities that there might be for investments under this new administration. And I'm going to talk about some specific opportunities, but because things are changing so rapidly right now, and because there's so many news stories coming out in the news about what might happen, what the administration might do, I thought it'd be more helpful to start by giving you a framework for how to think through these opportunities and whether or not they really are opportunities. So the first question you're going to want to ask yourself if you're hearing about some kind of government incentive that's being put into place is, how real and how lasting is that government incentive going to be? And I'll talk through how you can sort of get a sense of that. The next question you're going to want to ask yourself is, how much of the value of this investment opportunity is real versus just being based on people really wanting to put money into green projects right now? And the third thing to think through is, all those hurdles that Brandon was just talking about in terms of federal approvals, are those going to be any different just because you have a green project, some kind of renewable project, than it would be for a traditional fossil fuel project? And so these are some broader trends that we have seen with the new administration that are also important to kind of keep in mind as you're thinking through the value of your project. The first is that this new administration is very focused on climate change, on tribal issues, and environmental justice. Some of you may not have heard of environmental justice before. It's become one of the primary focuses of this new administration. Brandon touched on it briefly, but it's basically the idea that environmental harms should not disproportionately affect minority or economically disadvantaged communities. And we're seeing a lot of pressure in that area. The second big trend right now is that we're seeing large-scale investors who want to put a lot of money into green projects. And on a smaller scale, we're seeing a lot of customers who are willing to pay to have those green opportunities and pay more than they may have in the past for the green options. So I'm going to start by talking through government incentives. And these can take a variety of different forms. So here we sort of have a scale from least reliable to most reliable forms of government incentives that you might see. The least reliable is going to be a campaign promise. I think that's pretty obvious to everyone. A lot of things get said on the campaign trail that either never get translated into an actual policy, or they look substantially different once they do become policy. And so we can get signals from campaign messages about where an administration wants to go, but that's probably not going to be enough reliability and certainty for for making investment decisions. The next is going to be proposed legislation. Now, again, just because something gets proposed and just because it gets through the House of Representatives does not mean that it's going to become law. In fact, in a lot of instances, you have members of Congress who put forth bills so that they can go back and tell their constituents that they could, or so they can point to the other side or point to the Senate and saying, we wanted to do all these great things, but the Republicans wouldn't agree with us on these measures. They killed it. It's not our fault. So you'll see a lot of news about proposed legislation that has very little chance of actually becoming law. And it can seem pretty aggressive and pretty extreme because it's not necessarily meant to compromise. It's not necessarily meant to become law, but more to signal where a particular party would like to go. The next area, which has a little bit more certainty, are administrative initiatives. These are things that the executive branch can do through agencies without having to go to Congress. So passing new regulations, having new policies, a number of the things that Brandon was talking about earlier. Those have more lasting power because the executive branch can do it on its own. However, almost all of these are going to be subject to challenges in court. They can get held up in court for years. And frequently what we've seen is by the time, the court challenge will still be going on when a new administration comes in. And so you may not have actually even seen an on the ground change because it's been tied up in litigation for so long. And also because these are just an administration's initiatives, the next administration has the power to pull those back, to put out new regulations through the Administrative Procedure Act or to change its policies. And when we're talking about infrastructure investments, we're talking about projects that could take years to build. And so you can't have certainty that the incentives they put in place are necessarily going to be in place by the time you complete your project. Next on our list is legislation with sunsetting. And what I really mean here, and you'll see this in some of the tax examples we go through in a minute, are incentives that have passed Congress, but where Congress has decided to scale back the incentive over time or to end the incentive at a certain time. And again, with infrastructure projects that could be, years in the making, where you're not sure how long it's going to take you to get your permits, it can be a little bit hard to value the investment when you don't know what year you're actually going to be able to put your project into service and whether or not the incentive is going to be the same in that year. And then the most reliable form of government incentives is just legislation without any kind of sunsetting. As we all know, it is very hard these days to get anything through Congress. And so once it makes it through Congress, you can have a lot more confidence that it's probably going to be there for some time. So with all this in mind, I'm going to talk about some various incentives that have been bandied about with this administration. First is tax credits, and I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty here of these various tax credit programs, but I want to give you a broad overview of what's available, just so that you know that these are out there. So there's a couple different forms of tax credits. The primary ones right now for renewables are the production tax credit and then the investment tax credit. And you have to pick between one or the other. For a lot of renewable projects, both are available. But you can, for solar projects, you will only be able to use the investment tax credit. To be eligible for the production tax credit, the facility has to have begun construction before January 1st, 2022. Again, that's something Congress could change, and it frequently does. But this is one of the things that kind of creates some uncertainty in this area because you don't know if Congress is going to actually extend it. And beginning construction isn't necessarily what it sounds like. There's IRS guidance on this point. And so this is, again, something where you want to do your due diligence and make sure that the project is actually going to be legally commencing construction in time for you to get the incentive that you are building into your investment. This is, again, on the production tax credit. It gives you a little bit of a sense of what I was talking about earlier with the reductions over time. So depending on when construction begins. This is a tax credit that's been around for quite some time now, since 1992. You will see a reduction in the tax credit that you're going to get. So again, it becomes very important to determine when you're going to actually be able to commence construction and when you're going to be able to put your project into service. The other type of tax credit that I mentioned earlier was the investment tax credit. This allows you to take a deduction for a certain percentage of the value of the project from the income taxes of the company. This is actually something that's also available to individuals. So individuals who put solar panels on their home can take advantage of the same program. But as you can see, again, there's sunsetting here. It scales down with time. And so you need to have been able to get your project to begin construction on your project within the appropriate time frame to really take advantage of these benefits. Historically, what we've seen is, a lot of the entities that are starting these projects, they maybe don't have such a huge tax burden that these incentives are all that helpful to them. So what we've seen is tax equity investment, where a large investor with excess tax capacity will come in and provide equity financing, usually used to repay a construction loan or in some cases finance the developer's fees. And in exchange, they will get those tax benefits. We have a whole group of lawyers who does nothing but this kind of work. So if it's something you're interested in learning more about, we can talk to you about that. But it's something to also know about in terms of the financing that you can use these tax credits, and folks have done that historically. The next kind of opportunity I want to talk to falls into the administrative incentives or initiatives bucket. So President Biden, in one of his first acts coming into office in his first week, put out an executive order where he wants public lands to be used for more renewable projects. And for those of us in Texas, we forget how much federal land there really is out there because we don't have any in Texas. But if you go out west, there are huge swaths of states out there that are federal land. And the policies in place for the various agencies like the Department of Interior or the U.S. Forest Service on how that land is going to get used and managed can have a major impact. And so here you see that the administration has said that they really want to incentivize more renewables on public land. There's also public waters offshore. And this executive order specifically says that they want to double offshore wind by 2030. So we don't have specific, regulations that flow out of this. That's something agencies will have to do so that we know the details of how they would incentivize these kinds of activities. But we do know that coming from the top, there's encouragement of development of renewables on public lands. President Biden also recently put out what he's calling the American Jobs Plan. And this doesn't really fit easily into any of our buckets at the bottom because it's basically an administration proposal to Congress. Congress, we want you to fund all these things. We need legislation to do this. But here is our broad plan for what we would like to do. And this jobs plan proposes putting about $2 trillion in government funding over the next decade into infrastructure, the electric grid, high-speed broadband, climate change issues, and job creation. And this goes back to something President Biden has said a number of times about wanting to try and achieve 100% carbon-free energy generation by 2035. That's an aggressive goal, and so the federal government's going to have to do a lot to incentivize that happening. About 40% of the money is being put towards climate and clean infrastructure investment. And, this is an important piece too. We talked about environmental justice earlier. They're trying to spur investment in socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. In other words, can we get these renewable projects to communities who are socioeconomically disadvantaged to further benefit them. So here I've put up some more details of where they want to send the money exactly, so you can get some idea. But a lot of this has to do with infrastructure projects. And so there's kind of, depending on what comes out of Congress, the potential that there's going to be a lot of federal money in the form of loans flowing into these kind of projects, probably a lot of pressure on the federal agencies to be more lenient in granting permits for this kind of work, so that the administration can show that it's made real progress in some of these areas. He's also proposed putting a lot of money into what's called infrastructure resilience. This is the idea that climate change is going to cause increasing issues to our existing infrastructure, and that we need to do things to bolster it now so that we don't have weather events that cause major disruptions in our energy infrastructure. So there's probably going to be some opportunities in that area as well. He's also proposed some changes to the various energy tax credit programs that could be very meaningful if they come through. One is just an extension of the investment tax credit. Same thing for the production tax credit, as well as expanding the carbon capture tax credit, which is otherwise known as the Section 45Q credit. And another key change here is creating a direct pay option. So if you'll remember what I said earlier about the equity tax investments that happen, this might change that structure a little bit, because under a direct pay option, you as the person building the infrastructure project, even if you don't have this excess tax capacity that you need tax credits for, you could actually just get a reimbursement from the federal government when you file your taxes. A couple other areas. They also want to do expanded energy efficiency credits for home and commercial buildings, which could really affect the real estate market and real estate developers. And they're also trying to encourage more high voltage capacity power lines. So I thought this quote from White House Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy was really telling here, is right now they are not trying to get to the climate solutions they want purely through regulation. Right? They said, we're not making any promises, we're not making any demands right now, because this is basically about using the market to generate the kind of reductions we need. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the market and the private side. So right now, banks are under a lot of pressure to put money into green projects. Each of the major US banks has made a commitment to try and get to net zero or Paris Treaty aligned reductions in their financing of greenhouse gas emissions. And what that means is when they look at their investment portfolio, if they're investing in oil and gas or something else that's known to be carbon intensive, they're going to try and also invest in some either carbon neutral or carbon offsetting or green projects, or they're going to try and divest from those carbon heavy projects and go into more green projects. And there's now been a number of sort of both, in the US and international agreements that a number of these banks have signed on to, all saying, yes, we're going to try and get greener in our investment. And so what that means is there is going to be a lot of money flowing into green projects. So here you can see from some of the biggest lenders, the promises that they've made over the next couple of years for how much money they're going to invest in either low carbon businesses or otherwise things that reduce global greenhouse gases. And the reason I have the picture of the tulips up here is tulips are sort of the obvious historic example of when everybody decided that something could only possibly go up and we should all invest in it at the same time, and you ended up with a giant bubble, and of course tulips became worthless as a result. It's not clear that that's going to happen with green investment, but we do have a lot of large institutions that are under a lot of pressure to put a lot of money into green projects. And so there is some chance here that these projects are going to be overvalued just because there's so many people who are looking to invest in them simply because they've made these commitments and these promises. So that's something to also be aware of if you too are trying to invest in some of these projects, that they may be overvalued basically for these virtue signaling reasons. Same thing on the private investment side. We've seen just a huge growth in these ESG funds. I'm sure everyone has heard the term ESG for the first time in the last couple of years. And for these ESG portfolios, it's a lot of the same sort of policies and ideas that they're following in terms of trying to make themselves look more green, where they're either getting out of carbon intensive sectors entirely, or they're trying to get into sectors that are greener and more carbon neutral to offset their other investments. We've seen for businesses too, that they're trying to diversify their own business models so that if they have been carbon intensive in the past, they're getting away from that. They're moving towards also having a sector of the business that is greener, that is more renewable based, so that they can continue to attract capital when they need to. So now I want to talk a little bit about the hurdles that Brandon talked about earlier and whether or not they're actually going to be any different if you are looking at a green infrastructure project as opposed to a traditional infrastructure project. And again, the president put out an executive order very early on where he was really encouraging the agencies to lessen permit burdens for these green and renewable projects. That still has to get translated into actual policies and actual regulations before it can help. But at least in theory, we know they want to lessen the burdens. So the question is, will they? And I wanted to just highlight a couple areas where the administration priorities could either be your friend or foe. One is going to be on tribal lands. So this administration cares very deeply about consultation with tribes, about hearing their voice in a project. At the Department of Interior, which manages all of the public lands, we have our first tribal member who is an Interior Secretary. And so what this means is if you have a tribe that is on board with your project, if you're doing it on tribal land and they want it as well, you're probably going to see less trouble getting through the process. But if your project is going to affect a tribe, or a tribe has decided to fight it, as we've seen with the Dakota Access Pipeline, you're probably going to get more hung up than ever before. Same thing for environmental justice. If your project might negatively impact an environmental justice community or might run through one and they don't want it, probably more likely to get hung up. But if it's going to be servicing or helping an environmental justice community, then we know that's something the administration wants to encourage. And if you don't know if you're going to be impacting an environmental justice community, this map is actually from an EPA website that shows you where these communities exist, although this may also be something that's in flux in the upcoming months and years. Finally, you always have the risk from public opposition to your project. This is from a protest from the Keystone XL pipeline. It's probably one of the few pipelines that everyone in America knows the name of, primarily because of these protests and litigation that followed. So you may think that just because your project is green, you're not going to get public opposition. This is not true. There is a group for everything and that will fight everything. So if it's wind farms, there are bird groups out there that do not want their birds hurt and they will fight it. If it's a solar project, for example, we have this Mojave Desert tortoise, and there were groups protecting it, and so they did not want solar projects going in. And so that's just to say, don't think there won't be people fighting with you just because your project is green. And it's not just that they could bring protests and that there could be negative media. Most environmental laws actually have what are called citizen suit provisions, which means private groups can come in if EPA or the Department of Justice has not done so and take you to court and claim that you have violated an environmental law. They have the ability under many of these laws to seek civil penalties, to make you change things about your projects. They can get attorney's fees, which means they have the ability to find lawyers. And if nothing else, they can get your project tied up in litigation for years. So this is just something to be aware of. If you start getting pressure from public groups, don't think, okay, well, this is just a PR nightmare. Realize that it can be a litigation risk as well. So with that, I think we have a few minutes left, although not many for questions. So let me put up our contact information again in case you have questions later or have questions that you didn't want to ask in a group setting.
Hi, you discussed this in context of big infrastructure projects, but I assume this comes up in any land development that could impact, whenever we do developments, we get environmental reviews and there may be a bird or something on in a tree. So this comes up in all projects, not just large projects, I'm assuming.
It does. We used a couple of large linear infrastructure projects because they have such long tentacles that you're bound to hit 5 or 10 or 20 of these issues. But a small residential development or a manufacturing rehab or a small marine development, small projects can and likely do have some group that will oppose it in some way. Well, Corinne and I thank you for your attendance and for your attention. We are both available. Our contact information is there, and I will be here for the next several minutes during the break. If you'd like to come up and visit, we'll make touch. Thank you for your time.